Item number 7 on the agenda is local board input. There have been no requests for that. Item number 8 on the agenda is the question of extraordinary business. This is a procedural item, and I want to advise the meeting that under extraordinary business, I need to report to Council that I've received a resignation from Councillor Lee, Mike Lee that is, as the Chair of Strategic Procurement, and his replacement on that body. The reason that it's an extraordinary item is that I've just finished the process of consultation in order to determine who may replace Councillor Lee on that. So the motion is that we will consider that as extraordinary business under item 16. Do I have a seconder for that? Yep. Seconder, Councillor Cooper. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Item number 9 is notices of motion. There are no notices of motion. And item number 10 is the Housing Task Force report implementation. And could I ask Megan Tyler and Jared Bow to come to the table, please. Right, welcome, and can I get you, one or other of you, to Jared, to speak briefly to the paper.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and good morning, councillors. I'll just have a very brief overview of the report, and then we'll take any questions from you. In late last year, the Minister of Building and Construction invited the Mayor to propose arrangements to succeed the Housing Accord, which was due to expire in May this year. And although the Accord had delivered a large number of consents, at the time very few houses as a proportion of those consents had been built. And the Mayor considered that it was important to identify, beyond consenting, other significant impediments to building new homes at a pace and a scale to meet the demand created by growth and to catch up with the deficit in the current housing stock that has accumulated in recent years. The Mayor therefore decided to set up a task force to look into these barriers more closely and bringing in industry representatives to discuss issues and tangible solutions, the membership of which is appended in the report as attachment A. And a wider group of stakeholders were also asked to provide feedback to the Mayor, and we received 20 responses from that group, and those are also appended. And the purpose of the task force was to identify barriers and constraints to building more homes in Auckland at a pace and scale which meets the demand created by population growth, and identify options and make recommendations to overcome those barriers and constraints. It met 5 times between March and May, and in June this year produced a mayoral housing task force report, which I know that the members have received. It contains 33 recommendations, and those are appended to this report in attachment B. The task force identified 3 key areas where they believe changes are needed in order to deliver more homes in Auckland, and these were removing impediments to the construction sector developing at scale, including identify investors who can build through dips to lift construction in the peaks. Number 2, unlock the availability of land with appropriate zoning and infrastructure at the right price to enable more development faster. And the 3rd is delivering efficient and certain planning, consenting and risk management to reduce costs, enable innovation in construction and delivery, and create communities with high quality built and urban form outcomes. It is now proposed that a housing task force steering group be convened in order to prioritise those 33 recommendations where feasible and oversee progress and implementation of those. And the purpose of the task force steering group is to agree terms of reference for that group, prioritise the recommendations, both those that deal with council responsibilities and those that require collaboration with other partners as well as advocacy to central government, oversee the progress of council work across those recommendations, in particular focused on council responsibilities, and report on progress on implementing those recommendations to the governing body at regular intervals and also to the mayoral task force every 6 months. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much, Jared. Megan, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, sir. Happy to answer questions.
I will. I'll move the recommendations formally, but if I could just add an E, which I think we need to do, which is to use this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the members of the task force for their contribution. If you look at the people that made up that task force, if we were paying for their time as chief executives of Fletcher's, of Ockham, registered master builders, for example, Stevenson's, Todd Willis Bond, this task force would have cost tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I just want to, I think it's up on the screen now, to acknowledge those people who pro bono gave of their time and their commitment and came away thanking us for the opportunity. So I'll add that. Can I have a seconder for the recommendation? Then we'll move to questions. Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Questions, Councillor Newman.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I reserve my right to speak on this. Jared, thanks for the presentation, for the summary. I agree with the what you have spoken, and I particularly like the words "at the right price." So, with respect to the proposed tactical interventions, on page 26 of the report, tactical intervention 1 relates to the joint ventures. At the right price, the best way for us to deliver that is with respect to the land holdings that we already hold. So is that part of the work that you're looking to undertake with respect to that tactical intervention, or is that falling outside the remit of the task force?
Through the chair, I mean, the task force is really here to oversee the implementation. So as whether it's staff or government officials, and our CCOs will implement this. So, for example, if it's tactical number 1 you're looking at on page 26, then the staff will lead that work, but this steering group will oversee that and ensure that progress is being made. They'll get report backs on that work.
Do we have, a follow-up question, Mr Chair, do we as the governing body have to revisit the issue of expectations around price and divestment with Panuku in order to try and achieve some of the benefits of maybe more affordable housing, because we potentially have to take a haircut on price?
Through the chair, I think that would be a useful discussion with the steering group, and it may be that they perhaps recommend back to the governing body and or relevant committee that, or through the long-term plan process, that there be some change or reconsideration of that.
Thank you. Is that right to speak?
Yeah. A very good question in relation to a certain development that we're all thinking of in Manukau. The next question, Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you for the making this report available. I just have a question around this report, which was followed up very closely by a report that was done for Minister Joyce on quantifying the impact of land use regulations, which identified that the council's own regulations and red tape added 56% to the cost of an average house in Auckland, yet nowhere in this report has any kind of quantity of or percentage of what regulations may add to the report. Has that been identified anywhere in, as far as I can see, nowhere in this report?
Through the chair, well, I could say two things. There is a table in the report, just flicking through to try and find it, where various members of the task force provided, I think it's on page 18, provided a breakdown on various typologies of in terms of their cost components. These are just sort of case study examples. The second thing I'd say is the Sapiro report that you're referring to, I assume it's the same thing, with the range of 15 to 56% of the cost of a house in Auckland from land use regulation. There's a whole bunch of caveats with that. In terms of Auckland's situation, we know that they undertook that study prior to the enablement of the 422 odd thousand under the unitary plan properties, but also they also include infrastructure in this term land use regulation. So it suggests in the title that you're talking about council rules and building consent costs and red tape, as you would say, but it also includes the cost of roading and the cost of pipes and the cost of parks or libraries, everything thrown into that. So whether you know, and the methodologies themselves, I mean, that's why there's this range of 15 to 56. The Auckland Council's chief economist has done an internal memo, and I'm sure he'd be happy to share that with members in terms of the failings, in his view, of the methodologies used, and also in terms of the technical nuances of how that's defined in the report. So, you know, the headline was up to 56% of the average house price in Auckland is caused by regulations from council, which is a real stretch.
Well, as George Bernard Shaw said, you could lay all the economists in on end, you never reach a conclusion. And I think that's probably, I know of economists who actually think that the super report is spot on. They tend to disagree with our chief economist. Nevertheless, I think you would agree that council does add considerably to the cost of building houses in Auckland through its regulations.
I think the other side of that is sometimes where the regulations and from the national level weren't adequate, they added something like $600 million to our accounts for leaky homes. So it's finding the balance, I guess, that we need to do. Councillor Casey.
We had a workshop on special housing areas recently, and there was quite a long discussion about pricing and how we have no knowledge really of how cheap houses are, what's being built. And one of the staff said that this would be answered by the mayoral task force, but respectful to Daniel, that's number 1, Panuku, but I'm looking at number 6. Is that it? I mean, I'm talking about innovative ways to build cheaper housing, and I can't see that covered in here.
Through the chair, yeah, I think the 6 is the one that talks about investigating different housing typologies. Is that the recommendation?
That's what I'm looking at. Is that what you were? Staff
no, I mean, I think the staff were referring to the fact that there's recommendations around getting better and more up-to-date housing data in order to be able to track this. But I'm presuming that maybe would have been in terms of the workshop that I attended as well.
Okay, well then let me turn to number 6, because it says we're going to collaborate and lobby. Would number 6 be applicable to number 1? In other words, can we use the learnings from our analysis to ask Panuku and what was formerly the Hobsonville Land Company, now HLC, which stands for something.
Houses, Land and Community.
Houses, Land and Community. Is it an intention that we apply the learnings from one of these strands to another of the strands?
Through the chair, I assume so, yes. I mean,
You assume so,
yeah.
That's good. And my worry is there's an awful lot in here to do, and there's no prioritising of them. You're not going to do all of these things at the same time. So when we see a prioritised list back from the task force as to how important they think they are, and do we get a chance to say how important we think these things are?
Well, one of the core responsibilities of the steering group that's proposed is their first task is to prioritise some of these. I mean, in terms of how this report was written, it was done through the task force, and obviously the mayor and some councillors were on the task force, but the recommendations themselves were a collective group agreement, some of which are already, well, a lot of which are already entrained within council work, and with discussions with both the regulatory services and strategy, there is definitely room to move things around in terms of prioritisation. And so one of the tasks of the steering group would be to obviously there's some low-lying fruit that can be addressed, but also in terms of these 33 recommendations, obviously, like you say, you can't do them all at once.
Yeah, so my question was, how do we, the governing body of Auckland Council, input into that priority? It's a bit like talking to Auckland Transport. They come up with a big long list, and I say, excuse me, how do I get a say in this? That's my question.
Through the chair, recommendation D is to say that the steering group will report back to the governing body on progress. So it could be, if the body wishes to agree, one of the first report backs could be on the prioritised list that they've come up with, and an opportunity for you to view that.
That would be great.
It may be something you wish to discuss.
Thank you. Councillor Hollis.
Thank you. I've just got a few questions and then I'll speak to the recommendations later. I was just interested in seeing the makeup of the Housing Task Force members. I noticed Panuku wasn't there. Seems odd.
Notice two?
Was that...
Notice two?
Okay. They would. My question is that there's a very long list of to-dos. I just wonder where is it the role of the group, the follow-up group, to look at an implementation plan? Because we've had lists of to-dos for 6 years. We now have an even longer list of to-dos. Where is the implementation plan going to be developed by the sorry, we're calling it the task force group?
Through the chair, as part of that prioritisation and oversight role, one of the key things would be to timings, and so yes, an implementation plan would be undertaken. I think that one of the things that we didn't want to do or recommend at this point was to start reinventing the wheel in terms of what the council staff and are already undertaking. So the prioritisation of some of those things in between the members, which is why there's 2 senior managers on that steering group. So you can't do them all at once, and so whether we've got the order right at the moment, but a lot of, like I said, I think there's 16 out of the 33 recommendations are directly at council. The vast majority of those, I'd say 2/3 off the top of my head, are already pieces of work that are already underway in some way, shape or form. So I definitely think it's within scope of the steering group to via their prioritisation and oversight, to have some form of implementation tracking of how things are going.
So my last question, Mr Mayor, is, and I think you've touched on it really well, Jared, the vast majority of the recommendations are work that's already underway by council. So, we understood what the problems were, we've identified them, we've put in place work to get done. We've still got the problem of housing affordability. So the reality is we are one of the players. Was consideration given to having an implementation group that was made up of council, private sector and government, rather than simply yet another council group as the action group from this? Because we are actually quite a small bit player in the whole provision of housing in Auckland.
Yeah, I think the approach, through the chair, the approach we took was that essentially that's what we did with the task force. There are several of, in particular, the more strategic interventions that are whole sort of projects in themselves. And there's, like I said, I think there's 16 out of the 33 that are council-led. So the remainder, whatever that is, 18, 19, 17, require collaboration with central government and other players. And we've been working closely with MB in terms of the SHA data and things like that. But I think some of the items on this list, I think internally we wanted to have a look at, whether they have any, things like the recommendation around getting GST back from government. There's some that are on one end of the spectrum of possibilities versus digging into the building code, and I think that will be much more technical, and that's something where you would have a working group of actual MB officials and staff here working together on that. And the whole approach with this steering group is to have some oversight that I know the Accord had a whole range of things in it beyond just the SHAs and the housing delivery, and I'm not suggesting that they didn't get done, but I think having the steering group with a significant political component will give us some more clarity as to the direction we're heading in across the council with housing, whether it's the Panuku side of things, whether it's consenting, or whether it's advocacy to government, whether it's around the Housing Infrastructure Fund or whatever.
Okay.
If I could just add to that, Councillor, first of all, Panuku wasn't part but did make submissions, so they had an input, a direct input into the committee. Secondly, what we didn't want to have happen was have a report that came out and everybody said, yeah, great report, good ideas, and then it sat on the shelf and nothing happened. So we have a dual responsibility. One, ourselves, to respond to the recommendations that relate to council responsibility, but two, to ensure that there is advocacy to central government to make sure that we're getting a response from them on what the task force advocated they should be doing. And this was a high-powered group, and they have asked, can we reconvene in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, so we can measure the progress? And our steering group will feed back into the people that made the initial recommendations. So, you know, you don't put as much time as these guys and women put into it without saying, now we want to know what's happening about it. It may be that we can't do everything that is recommended, but the onus then will come onto government or onto council to say, well, look, we've thought about this, and for these reasons, we don't think that's practicable. In other areas like consenting made easy, we'd be able to say, hey, this is what you've advocated, and this is what we're a long way down the track to achieving. The SPV that was advocated in this, again, is something that we have achieved. So it's a way of measuring the progress we make. Councillor Sayers.
Oh, sorry, Mr.
Sorry,
Mayor.
Councillor
Just
Pulse.
another question. So out of that, and I completely agree, and it seems to me that, you know, this council has worked exceedingly hard, understanding very well what its role is and putting action alongside each of the areas that we have responsibility for, and that's been in train for a long time. However, the missing piece of the puzzle is still the government response to this and the private sector response to this. In an ideal world, we have formed a working party to look at overseeing and implementing our side of the bargain. Has any thought been given, or was a request made to government to form an interdepartmental government group corresponding with ours to implement their side of it, and a private sector multi-stakeholder group to implement their side of it? Because we are still a part player in this, and without this being taken seriously by government or the private sector, Ockham and the other fantastic developers aside, we will continue to circle in a helpful and meaningful and enthusiastic way without making any progress.
That's a very good question. And we have approached government directly and asked, we don't have a Minister of Housing overall at the moment, we have that subdivided amongst a number of ministers, and we've asked the government to appoint a points person that will be responsible for liaising with us on the government response to the recommendations that have been put in their direction. And cheekily, we've proposed that should be the Minister in charge of MB, as somebody that we thought would be quite responsive, and as the central agency that has responsibility here. The private sector is a little harder because there aren't always organisations that reflect the collectivity. But we will try to do that through, you know, maybe through working through groups like the Property Council or whatever association there may be of developers. So while we've had the best of the developers on our committee, we didn't obviously appoint the people that we didn't think quite fitted that description, but we need to get to them and say, these are the sort of things that we expect from you. So I think the value of the task force, beyond what's already been achieved, is that follow-up that you're suggesting, and that's what we're determined to do, and that's what the steering group is about. Councillor Sayers, next question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. And I appreciate the report. Thank you very much, and your presentation on it. And I do wish the Housing Task Force Steering Group every success and all the best, and look forward to the updates on it. But I just did have one question through you, Mr Mayor. If I just go to clause 15.2, it says the task force identified 3 areas where changes are needed in order to deliver more homes in Auckland, and 2 says unlock the availability of land with appropriate zoning and infrastructure at the right price to enable more development faster. Could I just understand the definition of the right price? Is there a definition around that, or some sort of benchmark that we're aiming for there, please?
Through the chair, I can't speak for the author or the task force in terms of what the right price would be. I think that this is a sort of a more generic statement that basically shows the themes of the recommendations and the meters in the recommendations. There were discussions around affordability, and one of the one or two of the sessions in particular, constantly battered around, going back to Councillor Quax's point in terms of what the level of price was coming from raw land, what the level of price that came from the cost of infrastructure, how much of it was speculation and land banking. So in terms of a direct answer to your question, no, I don't think there's a right price in the sense of an actual calculation of what they were referring to, but I suppose the whole suite of recommendations is about digging into a lot of the elements of the housing supply chain, whether it's around consenting, whether it's around building materials and getting those approved, or getting infrastructure rolled out in the right sequence in a timely enough fashion. And there are some recommendations that ask council to, I suppose, experiment and do things a bit differently, whether it's through a targeted rate or whether it's bringing perhaps land in the falls forward, depending on the carrot and stick involved.
If I can just add to that, the two areas we've mentioned are zoning and infrastructure. I think our previous council has met the first requirement by enabling the development of 422,000 sites, and the government has acknowledged that. The infrastructure is exactly what we were trying to approach under the Housing Infrastructure Fund and the Special Purpose Vehicle. And the right price, I guess, is around what we have in the housing market is market failure, that demand is much higher than supply. If we can bring forward the supply by enabling through zoning, but also enabling through infrastructure, then that puts a downward pressure on house prices. One of the problems diagnosed by all of the people on the task force, as long as you've got a whole lot more demand chasing limited supply, the only outlet to that is going to be rising prices.
Yeah.
Sorry, you had a second question, Councillor?
Failure.
No, thank you. But I think what you're saying, the market forces will determine the supply and demand equation there.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yes, my question's really just further to the question or the issue that Councillor Hulse raised, and that is really around the involvement of government, and frankly the rather limited nature of what's on the table. If we read the purpose of the task force, the critical thing there is meets the demands created by population growth. But what is the population growth? What is the rate of population growth? What are the scenarios under consideration? And what hope do we have to have any influence around that? What are the related issues around debt as it goes to council debt or government debt, around very long-term assets that are normally funded intergenerationally, and where is that debt going to be picked up? And frankly, unless you've got people in the process, and that is largely government, that have got a handle on those issues, it's literally a situation where we're being expected to pick up the pieces. So I really just want to put that on the table. I don't know that this is actually going to get us anywhere, and that's my concern. So I endorse the comments that Councillor Hulse made around the engagement of government around this.
I'm happy to address that.
Well, I could say through the chair, in terms of the issues around infrastructure funding and funding mechanisms and council debt, there are two recommendations in the report that address that sort of thing. Number 10, which is around implementing infrastructure scheme that is self-funded and talks about so that the costs of infrastructure are internalised with a party that benefits, and capture learnings to enable this approach to be scaled up. And then the 17, which is a strategic intervention one, which is around a whole range of possible ways of broadening sources of funding for major infrastructure. And in terms of the collaboration between government departments and a multi-stakeholder group, as Councillor Hull suggested, a role of the steering group would be a significant role in terms of the non-council, I'd call them the non-council recommendations, would be advocacy to government, and that's one of the reasons why there are proposed to be 3 councillors and the mayor on the steering group, that political advocacy is a critical part of what needs to be done. The idea that these recommendations can be just passed on to staff to implement is not feasible. So I think it's definitely part of the role of the steering group is advocacy to the private sector and central government.
Just further to my question around population growth, is this task force going to be making some assumptions around population growth? Is there going to be some engagement with government around that? Because otherwise, you don't know what you're responding to.
If I can answer that, when we thought about how we were going to set up the terms of reference for the task force itself, I've got very clear ideas on demand management as one factor in it, and also taxation. I could have pursued those particular objectives, but they wouldn't have got anywhere because those are not views that are shared by government, and the responsibility in those areas is exclusively government. So we made the decision at the beginning of this task force to focus on areas where we could bring council, the private sector and government together and focus on what we might be able to get movement on rather than making it broader. So I accept your point. You know, if you've got a demand, supply and balance, you could start to question things on the demand side, like international investment in existing housing or population growth. There was no point in us making recommendations on that for a solely government-oriented decision-making area. We focused on where we thought we could get some genuine movement out of government, so we quite deliberately narrowed the scope of the terms of reference of the original task force. That's not to say that your points are invalid. They are valid, but we focused on where we thought we could make a difference.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm not sure who the question is for, but I have some concerns that this, including the HIF fund and the special purpose vehicle, combined with a lot of this, ends up meaning that we're working a lot of greenfield up and focusing a lot on greenfield, which we need and which is going to happen anyway, but it sort of goes a little bit, tips the scale too much away from what the unitary plan goals were around the compact city and around, building, intensifying the city more. So I have concerns that we're just, going for a little bit of a greenfield party, which is going to put a lot more pressure on us transport-wise and jobs-wise and pushing people up to the fringes. The other thing is that I know the Panuku is mentioned in here a few times, and it's probably more a political question, but I think we need to be a little more creative, and maybe it's a discussion for the long-term plan, but how are we going to use the Panuku developments better to incorporate, whether it's first-home buyers or affordable housing or something? Because the developers or whoever is working on the Panuku developments are getting, pretty good outcomes. Obviously that's good, it's intensified, it's brownfield development, but what can we do in a way that makes sure it's first home buyers or has a percentage of affordable housing? That's still a question I've been asking that I feel like I haven't got much answers on. It may be the only opportunities we have for first home buyers or to make sure that the Panuku developments we're doing don't just end up a whole lot of people who rent out houses. That's that it's not just that. So investment properties, I'd like, there is a cost, I know there is a cost, but we need to work it out and how we can use the little land we have publicly owned that we're using for these Panuku developments into something that actually has bigger social, positive outcomes. So it's probably more a political question, but all these interventions are good, but I feel like we might just end up with more housing that's all the same price and actually doesn't give more access to the people who need it.
Through the Chair, just one comment on the first matter of greenfields versus the rest. Of course, this report doesn't sit in isolation of any of the other work that you are doing around long-term plan considerations, Auckland plan refresh considerations, which goes to some of Councillor Walker's comments about population growth and all that kind of thing. So I think it's important to see this in the context of everything else you're doing as well. And so part of your long-term plan discussions and considerations will be around packages of work that could lean one way or the other in terms of greenfields or the existing urban area. And it's an opportunity, if you felt that there was a rebalancing required, then that can be the work that you do through the long-term plan. So this task force report doesn't preclude any of that. I mean, the housing infrastructure funds, those kinds of vehicles aren't specifically greenfields. They can be just as applicable to the urban area. Just depend on what's agreed between, you know, the council and government about where it should best be used. So I see great opportunity for you over the next 12 months to look at that balance but of where the funding of infrastructure is best put.
If I can add the political side to that, first of all, while the HIF and the SPV have been focused on greenfield, where there is no infrastructure, it's not our intention at all to diverge from the goals of the Auckland Unitary Plan that the majority of housing development be in brownfield areas. And the quickest way we can get that, I guess, is things like CRL and light rail that provides the infrastructure so we can start to intensify along the arterial routes and the transport hubs. On the affordable housing, we only addressed one side of that, which is the market failure, supply and demand side. But, you know, there are obvious answers on affordable housing. We implied it very strongly through our first and major recommendation, which is build through the dips. When the heat comes out of the housing market, and normally the construction industry crashes and then takes a long time to get up, that is a time when an investor needs to come in and build more houses. And the obvious investor and the normal investor over New Zealand's history has been central government. And with all of the redevelopment of Housing New Zealand land, what we're pushing and encouraging government to do, I think with some response, is don't let the market go down, keep it going by putting more money in, and there's no better way of addressing the affordable housing question or no more direct way, if I can put it that way, than social housing. And that's not entirely a closed door with government, so we need to pursue that argument. Last question, Councillor Cashmore. Sorry, Councillor Casey, after Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, a lot of mine have been already handled. The one that I would like to comment on from perhaps you, Jared, is that the Housing Task Force was a really positive enterprise. The willingness of the people around the table to talk openly and frankly was, you know, amazing, quite frankly. And the complexity of the issues was also made more apparent. You know, this is not a Johnny-come-lately problem. This has been caused by 30 years, perhaps, of different things causing problems. And the solutions won't happen overnight. The solutions will take a little bit of time. The report, when it was released, received positive comment from the Prime Minister, Minister of Finance and the Minister of Transport. Have their comments translated down into the officials for any action plans that we know of at this point in time, or is this work we have to yet churn up?
Through the chair, not directly to us at the moment. I've spoken offline with the Auckland Policy Office officials. I think they were, because the task force report is a mayoral report, and I think they've been awaiting a response in terms of what Auckland Council plans are. But I think the aim of the steering group would be to have a significant component of what it will be looking at is the collaborative focus that was sort of developed over the time we were having those task force discussions, and in particular pursuing around the recommendations that specifically focus on central government. I mean, there's quite a few in here that just say, you know, encourage central government. Well, the steering group needs to decide how you do a bit of encouragement, as opposed to just leaving it to, you know, passing this down to council officers to try to implement.
My final question, Mr. Mayor, would be to build up capacity in the industry is going to take time. You can't deliver tradies in a wave of a pencil
from minister or from council, so that's going to take 3 to 4 to 5 years of development. The banking sector is another area where there's quite a bit of comment in the report, financial constraints and so forth. Do we have a response from the banking sector?
Through the chair, not at this point.
Thank you.
Okay, not last question, second to last question. Kathy Casey and then Councillor Chris Darby.
Oh, having found the ditching of heavy rail to the airport in a line item in a very lengthy report as a preamble to the question, I'm very careful now to go through long tables with many recommendations. There's one in here which I don't think is the remit of a housing task force at all, and that's, quote, implement congestion charging. I know we've just been talking about alternative funding methods, but it really worries me that if we, by signing this off today, and I'm not going to sign it off if that's in there, so I don't know how you're going to play this. I'll record my vote against that if you like, but that's a long way away from affordable housing.
Let me address that. It's political. That is a recommendation of the task force. The recommendations are what they are. You'll agree with some of them, you'll disagree with others. What the thinking behind that was that if we need to have a broader source of revenue, we needed to look at road pricing to provide the transport infrastructure that was needed. There was broad support for a fuel tax. There was also support for a congestion tax as changing behaviour. And actually, Council already has agreed to that by agreeing to the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, which committed itself to a form of congestion charging. So the reason that it is in a housing report is that one of the critical items of infrastructure to enable housing development is decent transport, particularly decent public transport, and you have to have a way of funding that. We wanted and we asked for broader revenue mechanisms from government, and there is currently a joint working group between council and government to look at smarter road pricing. So it's already happening.
Yeah, but Mr Mayor, you have to wonder what my job is. If we're delegating lots of these things to quasi-political groupings, some of which are elected and some aren't, then what's left for the governing body to just get back the reports of the task force at a stage where they're almost complete? It's a serious question. This is a wide-ranging remit for a task force, and I'm not happy with all of them.
Well, let me reiterate that the task force wasn't a council report. It wasn't even a mayoral report. It was a report to the mayor and the council. And I wasn't in the business, even if I'd wanted to, of saying to the members of the task force, no, you can only recommend things that everybody might like. They were their own masters of their own destiny. The report is what it is. That's an accurate reflection of what the consensus was on that report, and that leaves it open to any councillor, of course, not to agree to everything that the task force might have recommended. But it's not for us to say what should or should not have gone into the task force report.
But that's why the prioritisation of this list of recommendations is quite important. And my question back a while ago was, how do we get involvement in prioritisation? I mean, it's I'm
sure, Councillor, the steering group would be very happy for you to come along and make a submission to them.
I bet they wouldn't.
It's an invitation. Okay, Councillor Chris Darby. Oh, sorry, Councillor Chris Darby. And then
I don't have a
Finer.
question, Mr Mayor. I was just going to make comments. So you want to reserve?
No, we're going on to comments now. If we've finished questions,
just one question, Your Worship. So, and it just flows on from what Councillor Casey's just said. Here are the recommendations from the task force. So my head is saying that ultimately the governing body will end up deciding what we end up pushing forward.
Yep.
You know, I mean, even though congestion charging is in there, we still haven't, and I agree with Councillor Casey, we haven't decided a position. But am I correct that here's the recommendations, there'll be some discussion with us 6, 12, 18 months period, but ultimately it's going to be around this governing body that we will end up saying, okay, here is the end result of the steering group, and here are our recommendations to the governing body. Am I correct in that?
Yep. Absolutely. this group is master of its own destiny, or mistress, whichever term you want to use, just as the task force was. So substantive decisions don't get taken away from this body. We still make them here.
Okay.
Okay, we've exhausted questions. We're now on to comments. We've probably had a bit of comments, but open it up. Councillor Hulse, I think, is just getting a cup of tea, so if there's another councillor that wants to make a comment, Councillor Cashmore.
So really, Mr Mayor, councillors, leaving off from where I started just before, and that is, this has been 30 years in the making, and it is a crisis we have in housing, particularly unaffordability. It's been a crisis for lack of investment in finance and a lack of investment in people and in our society. We've done some of the work already. The unitary plan under Alf's and Penny's guidance in the last 2 terms has delivered an outcome of potentially 422,000 new dwellings over 30 years. The infrastructure shortfalls have been identified into those areas to make that happen, and the finance that's required in highlight numbers has been worked through by our staff. And part of the response to that has been the Housing Infrastructure Fund and the Special Purpose Vehicle announcements of late, but that is probably a start. The insufficient builds for many years have culminated in probably 30,000 houses of shortfall. That has created stress in the marketplace. Record immigration has also created that stress, and I'm not against immigration by any way or means, because these are, in many cases, there are people coming back from New Zealanders who are Kiwis, or Kiwis not leaving. The financial sector has also put pressure onto the market. And some of these things we can influence, and some of them we can't. We can only advocate. But no matter what we do, we need to understand thoroughly and open-mindedly what the tools are in the toolbox that we can help put there to deliver outcomes. And some of those tools we might have to have government sign-off for. And I don't know whether it's going to be congestion charging or fuels tax or breathing air space or whatever it's going to be. But what we do know is the investment needs to increase if we're going to deliver the outcomes we desired for more affordable housing and more housing per se in this city. We've had situations where there's been excessive land banking, and some of the things we've put in place this term might help disincentivise that. And that's some of the targeted rate work, which could apply to greenfields and brownfields. But also the financial arrangements announced over the past 2 weeks will also help bring some of that work forward, because the private landowners will see that the market will actually be able to deliver a lot more because of these financial instruments a lot sooner. I'll conclude, Mr Mayor, just by saying I'm not going to take a set position on any one set of alternates or different tools that we could use. I want to understand what all the tools are, what our options are, and through this methodology we can start doing that work. But the decisions that this council can make and need to make will have to be made by this council, where we have the legal prerogative to do so. And this particular task force's methodology is just a way to get to that point in the future.
Thank you very much. Agree with that. Councillor Hulse.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. You know, having lived and breathed housing over the last 6 years, I will apologise in advance if I do sound just slightly jaundiced about this. I think there's nothing more boring than councillors who've been part of something and passionate about something then behaving badly when, you know, they're not necessarily part of the go forward. So I put that out there, and I hope other councillors listen to that. We've got topics coming up that may repeat some of that. So first of all, Mr Mayor, I want to commend you for actually calling this housing task force together. I think by putting the mayoral stamp on this, it made it absolutely clear that this is the most critical issue we're dealing with, and I think the mayoral task force was long overdue. I'm also very glad to see my fellow councillor, Councillor Linda Cooper, on there. It's very good to have a woman there. It's amazing what a little bit more gender balance will actually do to the discussion, so I'm very glad to have her there. However, I'm worried that we are potentially going to squander a very good opportunity. I stand by my initial point that I think it feels a little bit like yet another shopping list, where these are issues that we've tried to address for the last 6 years, and the list is actually no different. It's the same list in a different guise. However, sometimes you have to keep saying something quite often to actually make progress, and as my ex-mayor Bob Harvey used to say, sometimes it's wrong to be right too soon. So maybe this is the time to actually bring some of these together in a more comprehensive way. What I'm hoping is that we might end up with a slightly more sophisticated approach, and that was the reason for my question in the beginning about what is the reciprocal reaction by government to this. Now, our current Prime Minister, Bill English, in his previous guise as Deputy Prime Minister and also his housing responsibilities, has had reports like this over the last 2 years, and there has been not a lot of action from government on that. So the bit I'm looking for in this, Mr Mayor, and I think this is where I think some serious table thumping is going to be needed by this group, is to say what are the key changes that will actually change some of the central government approach to this? Council has almost wrung the cloth dry in trying to pick up the issue around land provision, around changing our consenting, around doing everything we can to meet our obligations. We can always do more, and I want to compliment the staff for finding what the more is, and the group, our task force here, can keep doing that. But without government agreeing on putting some serious building targets in place and to ramp up the current, what I think of as fairly marginal Housing New Zealand building rate, I think they need to seriously ramp up, and this is where we need to make that happen. They also need to, and I know we've got HIF and we're desperately grateful for the money that we get, but if the government is going to make a serious difference, they need to fund the enabling infrastructure for housing. We cannot do that. So I guess that's my second point, is what is this task force and this report going to do to say to the government, thank you, you've done reasonably good so far, but if we're going to get houses built, we need to redouble our efforts on that funding. For God's sake, fund Auckland, because we can't build houses without the infrastructure. How about we do that then? And finally, it's really good. We've all known that building through the gaps and building through the troughs is absolutely what we need to do, but we need to change some of the banking methodologies and the availability of money to do that. Developers, fantastic as many of them are, they are not there for reasons of goodwill and kindliness. They're there to make money out of their developments, and they're not going to start putting spades in the ground unless they can guarantee to their shareholders a profit into the future, and good on them. We need that. That's good for business. But if the banking sector will not allow that to happen, and we're looking at, a drop in things in the next 5 to 10 years, actually the banking sector need to assist with that, and the government need to assist with that. So building through the troughs, we need to get serious around tables in Wellington to change some of that. So Mr Mayor, I compliment and wish the working group well with setting priorities, but the bit that I'm really interested in is around the tables in Wellington, who's going to make those changes and who's going to be working with the private sector to assist them through some of the challenges they've got. I hope that's what the task force focuses on, and I wish them well. Thank you. Sorry, one last point. I don't often talk a lot around this table, so when I do, I'd quite like to get it all out there. The other thing is, I think as part of the shopping list, the bit that's missing for me is we really need to know our status at the moment. What is our kind of ground zero now? And what does, at the risk of sounding glib, what does success look like? There's nothing in here that tells me how we will measure what we're doing. Otherwise, we'll be sitting around the table in another year with yet another list of priorities and another shopping list. So let's get serious around where we're heading to, because when we look at our LTP and our government budgets next year, we need to know what those financial asks are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hulse, and for the wisdom of your experience on that. Councillor Newman.
Mr Chair, I want to acknowledge your work in establishing the steering group and say that I think it's got some, it's a really commendable purpose behind that. I think it's impossible to consider this issue in isolation from where we have come from. Councillor Simpson was chipping me before and laughing because I declare that I have quite a liberal, classic liberal view with respect to the importance of private property rights. People who own property have the right to develop it and they have the right not to develop it. But it also cuts both ways, Your Worship, that people have the right to participate in democratic processes about how development and the effects of development affect their property too. And so for me, I step back and I reflect on the story of the special housing areas and the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Act. And I think that there have been some really sad effects on existing communities. We have seen information that's been provided to us. I think the mixing of targets, the 39,000 new dwellings and new section sites consented within 3 years. Consenting sections is a long way from houses delivered. And there are 154 so-called special housing areas that were identified and agreed with the government. Well, the so-called benefits of delivering those SHAs, I think, is contested. Streamlined consenting processes and plan change timeframes. That, to me, is scope for limiting the scope of affected communities to participate in consideration. Limited notification, there is a risk around that. It's a risk around interested parties not being able to have their say, and the limits to the appeal rights, because the right to lodge a merit-based appeal, particularly around the unitary plan, Your Worship, I think was highly constrained. So, I think that when we consider the benefits of the work that has taken place to date, it is impossible to do that without reflecting on how that has impacted on existing communities. So we go forward to what the the Housing Accords and the Special Housing Areas Act was set up to do. It was set up to enhance affordability by facilitating an increase in land and housing supply in certain regions and districts, including Auckland, which have been identified as having housing supply and affordability issues. Well, we were told the other day that 154 SHAs would deliver approximately 66,000 estimate sections and dwellings over a 20 to 25 year period. We were also told that we're running at about 16% with respect to dwellings and consented sections created. That's actually not a particularly good success rate, in my view, when you consider all of the pain that has been sustained by communities that have felt concerned but shut out of the process for determining these SHAs. So, Your Worship, we come forward to the Housing Task Force report, and I've read that. I've read the recommendations. I think there are some good recommendations. I do think there is a need for prioritisation. I think that the best tactical intervention is set out, number one, which was on page 26. It provides the most realistic opportunity. But even on that front, Your Worship, we're already in trouble. Because in my own ward, we've got Barracliff Place, which hit the headlines in early June. And it is a culmination of months of divergent wheel skinning. We have our own CCO, which in my view appears to be a victim of divergent objectives that have been endorsed by this council. On one hand, does the governing body mandate Pārnuku to deliver more affordable housing at Barracliff Place, or, noting the capital constrained environment within which we operate, does the governing body require Pārnuku to maximise its the return on divestment? And I think it's the latter with respect to Transform Manukau, because the entire stage development around that project is funded through land sales. So, Your Worship, we have the SHA process that has made some landowners very wealthy. But I don't think that that's necessarily made a discernible difference in terms of the quantum of housing that is affordable. And probably the most realistic intervention that we could make at this time is look at those land parcels that the council does have and to make a decision around what our policy expectations will be. Do we require a maximum return on land holdings, or are we prepared to facilitate a policy whereby we take a haircut in order to get a policy intervention which actually delivers some affordable housing for needy communities in parts of Auckland, like in my ward? So I would request, Your Worship, that you address the conundrum at Barracliff Place, because I think it is important, and there will be other land holdings around the Auckland region where we can potentially provide some clarity to Panuku. I'll be meeting with the Chief Executive of Panuku again tomorrow, but I would request that you take this matter up and that this task force and the governing body takes up not only the conundrum of our divergent policy objectives in relation to the sale of land, but also that we address, once again, try and address the issue of affordable housing in a policy context. It is not reasonable, in my view, to give investors and developers, this is my final point, Mr. Chair, Your Worship, it's not reasonable for us to give investors and developers all of the upside through a highly permissive unitary plan, significantly achieved, I think, through the truncating of the rights of neighbours to object to developments that have adverse effects, whilst wholly relieving those same investors and developers of a requirement to provide at least a cohort of housing that meets the needs of those people in our community who require affordable housing.
Thank you, Councillor. I was a little remiss on your time by allowing you to go over quite considerably.
I hope you enjoyed the experience.
It was a good contribution. Can I foreshadow to members? I am going to enforce the 5-minute rule. I think it's important. I think the contribution's been really good, but we need to get through our agenda. But thank you for those points. I'm not in any way reflecting on the quality of what you said. Councillor Richard Mills.
Again if you like.
No, I definitely don't like.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. I think this is good. I think it's important that we take what we're responsible for and lead on that. I think it's also important that we continue to advocate strongly to government and others who are involved in the housing process. I know there have been comments from government months ago saying that we were holding up land supply, when we know there are many, many tens of thousands of consents being awarded but no buildings being built. So we need to make sure that we actually push back and say we're doing our bit and others need to do their bit as well. The other thing, I'm happy the steering group is there and is going to be watching over this, but I think it's really, really, really important that you also put yourselves into the shoes, or try to, of people that are adversely affected by housing. It's not just about putting a few more houses or a few thousand more houses or getting the stats up. It's actually about what are we doing for the people in cars? What are we doing for the people around our city who are being totally priced out of not just buying houses but also renting in houses? What are we doing to continue to advocate to government around protection for people renting and other things like that, the things that we can't do but we need to continue to advocate for, because those are our residents and our people. What can we do to continue to push for our own social housing responsibilities, or maybe we turn into producing more social housing ourselves? I don't know what the answer is. We do it for some older residents, and I think we should do it for some more older residents, but there may be other options that we need to be thinking about that we can be responsible for or push for in our community, especially in those Panuku development areas, which we're putting a lot of time and money into, but how can we make sure there's more social outcomes? I think it's also important that we think about, or continually over this time with the steering group, think about the young people in our community, the young people that come to me or who I used to work with in my old job, who laugh at the fact of ever being able to buy a house. It's just not on their scheme. I look at my sisters who come from a middle-class family who both have good jobs, who just say they are never going to buy a house. It's not even in their plans anymore. So, you know, we need to make sure that this group and everyone else is thinking about those things. It's not just about the words, it's not just about the price of materials, it's not just about the bylaws, it's about the people and how we are dealing with that. And we don't just tick off things and say, woohoo, we've got another 20,000 houses out in rural Auckland. We need to think about the whole thing. How are those people going to travel? Where are the jobs for those people? I know we can't do everything, and the market it has to do a big job, and we can't control things, but it's actually about thinking about what we want in our cities. We do not want suburbs which is just older retired people living in the houses where their kids used to live in, because it's actually impossible for them to change and sell their houses because they don't want to be put in retirement homes maybe out on the skirts either. So I think some of these recommendations are good and some of these will make a difference. But I want them to be more than just words and more about people, and for everyone every day, even if you have a checklist of who in our community you're thinking about while you're making decisions, while you're looking over the paper, because it's very easy when we're sitting in a position of some privilege not to really think about how those people are being affected and what their hopes and dreams are living in our city and our suburbs. And so we continue to have diverse suburbs forever, not just where people can afford to live. So yeah, I think it's good, but I think we do need some other things in there, like putting something around first-time buyers. That may not mean about affordable, but you know, Glenfield in 5 years has turned from a $450,000 suburb to a $900,000 to $1 million suburb for fairly average housing. Someone I know lost out on an auction yesterday in Henderson for a house that probably needs $300,000 worth of work, and it went an auction for $1.3 million, and it's just a small 3-bedroom house that needs a lot of work. So, yeah, I think that it isn't. Yeah, no, but I'm just saying that the suburbs that used to be affordable for a lot of our residents are not, and I don't see how we fix this fast. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. And I'm assuming that we're speaking to this now, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. My particular concern is around the how of how we do this, and in particular I'm looking at the words oversee the progress and implementation of the recommendations. And my concern, frankly, goes to a number of the points again that Councillor Hulse raised, and it's around, frankly, generating another report around a number of things that we already know. What we put out needs to be very, very hard-hitting. It needs to be very simple. It needs to be designed to the market that we're talking to, that is clearly the government, because they are decision makers that are very involved with this, and also to the general public. My concern is at this point in time, I don't think the public get it. A very good snow job has been done, basically laying the blame for the housing crisis, so-called, on the council, when it is absolutely not the case. The figure of 422,000 homes was met. So the critical tests are, what do the government ministers understand, and what does the public understand in terms of the information that we are communicating? The matter of timing is very important in terms of the tools that are being applied here around various sources of alternative funding and the like. And we need to point out that this is a real crisis and time is running out. There are a whole lot of things that we should have done, frankly, years ago. They are not in place. So there needs to be some realism around how whatever measures are being put forward by this task force have any prospect of success without buy-in. So I guess the concern that I'm raising is how the task force is communicating this information, who is it communicating to, how bluntly is it addressing it, how simply, so that people understand it. Because part of the crisis that we have right now that I'm putting is that not enough people understand it.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. And last speaker, Councillor Chris Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I'd also like to acknowledge you. Last November we spoke, and you quickly took this issue of the housing crisis by the scruff of the neck, and there was just no holding back. You were determined in the way you articulated to a few of us that this was a key issue that you were going to get your head around, and you quickly committed to this task force. I just want to acknowledge also, it's the last recommendation there, it's the E, but I do want to acknowledge the commitment, tremendous contributions from the task force members. I think that includes, in some ways, that motion ourselves, Mr Mayor, but we're referring to the external members. They were economists, they were financiers, they were medium developers, they were large developers, they were large construction companies, they were medium-sized construction companies, architects, urban planners, transport strategists. It was a tremendous cross-section. And we did have a conversation about how big the group could be, but we wanted it to be contained so that we could actually have some pretty frank discussions over not just one day, but quite a few days, with intermediate sessions where technical officers were really rigorously examining some of the key points that came up at each session. It was a very tough and rigorous group of individuals. They were very generous in their time, of course, but they were very generous in their contributions and revelations. I was quite stunned sometimes, Mr Mayor, as I think Councillor Bill Cashmore has just reminded us. Some of the things that were put on the table were, I would have to term, trade secrets. And we had very large companies putting on the table in front of us, so determined they were to get to the nub of the issue that they were prepared to open the book of their own company. And there was stony silence at some points, and after that stony silence, other players revealed their secret processes, so to speak. It was tremendous contribution from all of them. I have to say it was also expertly facilitated by Bernard Hickey. I think he really did quite an incredible job, as you did too, Mr Mayor. In some ways, I was there as a bystander to just soak it up and not get in the way. I just learned so much. I just learned so much that I never knew in all my years of local government about the housing sector and some of the barriers to delivering housing at pace. And while I guess, the Housing Accord and the SHAs, and I acknowledge the staff and the political commitment to all that body of work, the jury's still out on the success of that, to be honest. And hopefully we will learn in time that there has been success. I think there's been success in terms of supply of dwelling units and, considered sections, etc., but definitely not on another key purpose, affordability. That has been a failure of the Housing Accord, and we've seen affordability, the ratio between house price to income since the Accord was struck in 2013, from 6.9 up to 10. So look, we've got some real challenges in front of us. Building costs were not addressed as outlined in the Accord. Skills shortage were not addressed, and the Housing Task Force has picked up on that. Council is, in my view, not a bit part player. It cannot afford to be ever considered a bit part player in this. We have got to be considered the lead, along with government, and I hear a lot of the debate today challenging government. Look, we can't do this without some pretty keen collaboration. It's not just going to be this government and that government, but it's also got to be with the private sector going forward. The blowtorch is indeed on housing now, and it will be that way for a very long time, because this is not going to be solved overnight, let alone in half a decade. And that is the brutal reality of the challenge before us. Some of the recommendations are underway, some have been discussed in various fora, that's fair to say, but too often it's been ad hoc in the way these matters have been discussed. They've been disconnected. What I do like about the approach of this task force is it's cross-referenced and integrated a body of work, the work streams into a package of recommendations. Yep, there's some challenges there because and these are unanimously agreed recommendations, I would like to add. The housing crisis has to be led by the two parties. Look, Mr Mayor, just in closing, the severity of this problem is emphasised by some stats numbers that have just come through in the last couple of weeks. Our population is about to hit 1.57 early next year and 2 million by 2028, not 2035. So this housing crisis and the sub-crisis of affordability is right in our sights now. We've got a 43,000 home deficit as of today. It's an enormous challenge. We cannot shy away from it. And if we do, we will not. We will continue to forcibly exile our young talent to other cities and countries, and the wisdom of the older population, which is also exiting Auckland. Thank you, Mr Mayor, for taking this by the scruff of the neck and obliging us to take it by the scruff of the neck.
Thank you very much, Councillor Chris Darby. Final speaker now is Councillor Philippina.
Look, and sorry, Your Worship, I saw the body language change when Sandra told you that I wanted to speak, so my humble apologies.
It was not personally directed,
it was
that I had to bring the debate to an end.
So look, I firstly wanted to acknowledge Councillor Hulse, as she said, around the work that she's done in the last 6 years, as well as members around this table that have been there. But Your Worship, I went through the agenda again because there was one thing that I was concerned about, but I look forward to this discussion, and that is number 18 on page 22. Now that relates to the exploring the merits of basing ratings on land value, not capital value. Now that particular one, as you know, prior to amalgamation was a very big talking point amongst us. We obviously through legislation ended up getting capital value. I have raised this particular issue with our finance staff around a discussion whether land value, annual value or capital value moving forward. We need to open up that discussion because that particular one in there I think is going to be a very big subject when we end up discussing it. But I just wanted to raise that particular issue, because it is going to be. We had annual value at Manukau City Council, and other TLAs prior to amalgamation had different. But I think that particular one, because when I got onto council in 03, land value is what we used. And that was controversial from my perspective, because I was getting calls left, right and centre around land value that we had in 2003. So I've taken up about a minute and a half, but I'm just raising that particular issue, Your Worship, because I think that is definitely one that will generate a hell of a lot of debate.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and I wasn't reflecting on your contribution. I was reflecting on how long the debate had been. But if I can just sum up, and it's hard to sum up, look, I think every contribution's been a very good contribution around the table. And what that demonstrates to me is how important the issue of housing is to every one of us, for our wards and for the city. I want to acknowledge Chris Darby and Bill Cashmore for being on the task force and putting that time in. I think we all had the same feeling about it. It was a really worthwhile exercise. I started the process with a real fear that maybe it wouldn't gel, maybe nothing would happen, everybody would disagree. But it came together, and it showed, even with the government participation, I had some battles with the Minister of Housing Development, and he said he wanted, he didn't want to have people there because the government would then, by insinuation, be held to what we decided. But we were able to turn him and the government around, and they went there as active observers. Fortunately, they were more active than observers, but it was really important to pick up Councillor Hulse's point that you actually get the big players into the same room. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time we've had local government, central government, and a wide range of industry players together. And it did produce some electricity in that room. And it did produce some proposals that I think were insightful and took us forward. Councillor Hulse, I agree entirely. After you've done this for a while, you think, God, we've been there, we've said that. We've got to keep saying it. The only way we'll get a response is because we are raising the issues that are critical to our constituents. And the government does, of course, have to be a big player, but we've got to have some skin in the game too, and we've got to show that we want to contribute and we want to collaborate. What came out of it, no silver bullet, but a range of different things that would really help. And I think, my personal view, there is nothing more fundamental than housing. If you don't have a decent house, how do you get your kids good education if it's damp and cold and unhealthy? If you don't have a decent house, how do you maintain your health to turn up at work and not be constantly ill? I mean, these are things that we see around our patches, and they are critical to us. I think that, one of the frustrations I have in this job is because we don't have independent revenue, I feel I'm constantly going cap in hand to make a case to government, and that's really frustrating. I'd rather we had independent revenue. We don't, so we have to do that, and we have to collaborate. And I agree, Councillor Walker, that it was unfair that council was being blamed for the housing crisis. But the last council, if I can pay credit to them and to Penny in particular, getting the Auckland Unitary Plan through was a remarkable achievement. I watched it from the outside. You voted for it unanimously, and I congratulate you for it. I thought that might still be a problem that had to be picked up, but you did it, and you had the courage to do it. And that gives us credibility now to say, we've got the planning, let's get on and get the infrastructure, because the planning without the infrastructure isn't going to take us anywhere. And somebody else raised the point about the banking sector. If they're not part of the team too, and we don't have the finance, it can't happen. Councillor Hills, can I thank you for drawing the attention to the people not sitting around this table, the people who are homeless, the people who are paying half of their income in rent, the young families that would desperately love to have a home in Auckland and don't believe they ever can. That's what we're here for. That's why we need to be involved in this area. Councillor Newman, I take your point about Barracliff. You've explained the conundrum. Now you and I have got to sit down and say, what is the answer to the question that you raised? So I'll be asking you as well as you asking me, but it is the question that does need to be asked. So look, for everybody that's participated in that debate, thank you very much indeed. Can I draw your attention to the recommendations? There are two changes. The one at Councillor Darby's instigation, and I thank him for it, is acknowledging the task force members for their contribution. And the second thing, picking up Councillor Simpson's point, the need for Panuku to be involved in that oversight group. So if Council is happy, I'll take those recommendations A to E as a whole.
Mr Mayor, before you do...
Yep. Sorry, where am I looking to? Councillor Quacks.
In terms of D, I wonder if we could be a little bit more specific about the report period of, periodically could mean once a year, could mean once every 2 years, once every term. So I wonder if it could be 6 monthly or quarterly perhaps, depending on what, I'm not that fussed about what the period is, but as long as it's reasonable, maybe once every 6 months.
Yeah, Councillor Casey, that was your point as well, was it? Look, I'm happy to accept that as an amendment to change periodically to 6 monthly. If you
too important. Quarterly.
Yeah. I think let's settle on 6 monthly, and we have the opportunity to adjust that further. So if I can ask for that as amended to 6 monthly. If everybody's happy, I'll put the recommendations as a whole, A to E. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried and carried unanimously. Thank you very much for that and for the quality of the debate.